Hey everyone. Hey everyone, I'm Theodora, and this is the first episode of the series, The Intertextual Animal, in which I will be looking through the morphing textuality on the web. I'm sorry to everybody who were waiting. We had some technical difficulties, and thanks to Scott and David's patience, everything is now ready to go. And I'm ready to present you my first guest, David Amerland, who is an author and a speaker, thinking through our digital and analog, if I can say this, lives. And I will be speaking with him about digital communication and the way it changes our worlds and our ecosystems, business included. So, without further ado, I'll ask David my first question and escape the awkward feeling of making him present himself. David, do you want to present yourself or?
Excuse me. No, I'm okay.
Okay. So let's start with the great, magnificent question. What is the very difference between communication and digital communication?
That's an easy one, or a difficult one, depending.
Yeah,
well, every time we communicate, we use obviously some kind of medium. The medium which we use has particular constraints. It is easy to think of those constraints in terms of bandwidth. And the bandwidth then determines the granularity, the depth, and the accuracy of a communication. And to make this evident, let's think of pigeon post. If we go back a few years, and if the only way I could communicate with you was with a raven, I had to quickly scribble something on the raven's leg and send it off. The bandwidth was pretty narrow. Maybe I could get 2, 3, 4 lines. In order to get more meaning into those 4 lines, I would probably have to use some sort of shorthand code so you could understand a lot more. And then I would have to wait for you to reply so that I would know that you got the message, you understood it, and we have a communication going. That's the constraints of the medium. We go into the digital world these days. It appears very frictionless. We can communicate with almost anybody, anywhere, at any time, and say pretty much anything. And almost worse than that, we can, within limits and within reason, almost be anybody. So we can be other than ourselves. There are complications to this because everything which we do and everything which we engage in at length becomes part of our identity curation. Identity curation is what we engage in naturally in order to understand who we are. Understanding who we are is necessary because it helps us make sense of the world, and then it helps us make sense of our role in the world. So in order for us to get out of bed in the morning, for instance, we have to have a reasonable understanding of our place in society. And if we take that into the digital sphere now, which increasingly is part of the offline world as well, because the divide has eroded to such an extent, everything which we do and everything which we engage in is part of a longer narrative that is informed by our values, our sense of history, our knowledge, our perspective, our biases, and our understanding of how these things evolve. So the medium itself allows us now to perhaps do more than ever. It allows us to accomplish perhaps more, but at the same time, it also allows us the opportunity to make more mistakes, create more misunderstandings, and create perhaps greater polarization with a lot less effort than ever before. So these are the challenges in a nutshell, which we face today because of the medium which we're in. So digital communication is just another word for communication in the 21st century. It's like saying raven communication. We had ravens in 16th century, for instance. Okay, we had pigeons first.
Okay, so if because in the digital realm, everything seems as if very easy, but it's not. And when we talk, you said a longer narrative. how do you build in this longer narrative, this big semantic network of things and thought into a digital manifestation?
The longer narrative is the accumulation of everything we do. Now, there are different ways of doing this. One is through conscious effort. If we, for instance, intentionally, what we need to remember is that in the digital realm, unlike the the offline world, we hear by choice. Although that distinction also is beginning to be eroded, okay? Because everybody who has a smartphone now perhaps hasn't got a choice but to be in the digital world. Anybody who wants to get a job or get some social credit or form some kind of connection outside their immediate circle needs to be online. So when we actually think how we create the identity narrative of ourselves, it has two elements to it. One is conscious. We decide to do things. This is part of our reflection of how things are, our belief system, and so on and so on. And through those actions, interactions, engagement, and so on, this becomes part of the conscious thing of element of who we are. There's a subconscious element to that. That is the one that is generated by the data which we, which we produce, which is tracked. So this is what we give off to search engines like Google, for instance, social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so on. So basically through a conjunction or a sort of a union of those two things, we begin to create a sense of a digital identity, which is again multifaceted and multidimensional.
I understand. It reminds me of something I wanted to start the talk with, which is this theory that on the web, we are actors and we act, and acting, we're leaving trails. And then behind this, there are authors of the whole of this acting. They are connecting the nodes, and these are the algorithmic authors. So let's think through this. Algorithmic authors behind what you write on the web.
Yes, in a sense, the algorithms which are part of the fabric of the digital domain track our activity to a great extent, and it's not just cookie tracking. I mean, Google has developed technology which now tracks you through a trackless signature, where if you have specific devices and engage in specific activity, it becomes part of your profile, which enables the company to determine who you are, what you do, and so on, even though no cookies are involved. Now, this is just pure and simple metadata. The digital domain allows us to see all that, to collect it, to analyze it, and to infer a lot more from it than ever before. So we understand a lot more.
Okay, so what's the way of seeing the totality of the place where we act in? When we start being on the web, how do we conceive of the web?
That's a tricky question, mostly because it relies on perspective. Because we're here intentionally, certainly in the beginning, what we conceive of the web is determined by our own intention of how what we want to achieve while we use it. And again, to sort of narrow this thing a little bit, suppose that I want to sell used cars, and I choose the web and remote buying as my means of doing so. And the first thing which I need to do, obviously, here is to establish a sense of trust and trustworthiness in what I'm doing and so on. So therefore, everything which I will do will aim to do that in order then to go into the next proposition, which is that, hey, what I'm selling is actually of good value and there is a reliable channel for you to actually access it. So we come through in digital domain, we come through to many of the human qualities which we try to establish in order to actually have the kind of relation exchange that we would have in the offline world.
Yeah, but it seems that these days I'm having some thoughts about that selling on the web, that conceiving of the web as a selling medium. What if it is first a digital sense making medium, an exobrain, you once called it? What if we start from there, even if we are a business?
We conceive of the web or any kind of technology as a selling medium because relational exchange that has a transactional value is easy to understand because we can see the motivation behind it. But obviously, any kind of technology, and it doesn't matter what it is. If we go from, papyrus to paper to, tape to disks to ones and zeros in the cloud, is essentially a repository of information, and we are information clouds ourselves. So information being there, performing, connecting, exchanging, interacting, engaging is what actually makes everything possible, and that's how these things actually connect. So your idea that something is informational driven as opposed to just purely transactional is actually quite correct, because in many instances we need information before we can perform any kind of transaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, where does the information stop? I stopped hearing you, David.
Sorry, say it again.
Mm-hmm. Where's the boundary between information and marketing?
Well, if we think that any kind of, marketing in many ways is information.
So says the marketer.
And an advert in itself is information. The question is it the right kind of information, and is it the kind of information that is accurate and can you trust it? Now, information that is accurate and trustworthy is the information you can engage with. And if we talk about marketing, that's exactly the kind of information that any marketer would want to actually share, because that's what gives them the engagement they need in order to market to somebody. So all kind of information, and everybody has a vested interest in information being as accurate as possible. And I don't think there's a huge distinction which you can make between information that is there for transactional purpose, i.e. Product specifications or even a sales message, and information which is being shared simply, seemingly, for the sake of being for the sake of being shared, and that's because when somebody shares something just for the sake of it, there's still some kind of intent behind it. There's still idea and belief system behind that action.
Okay, so within that context, it looks like everybody shares information on the web, and as there's a book about everybody writing. Within that context, if everybody writes, what are then the content writers doing?
That depends purely on the intention of the content writer. So if a content writer writes just to share a passion, that is still part of their identity curation effort. If they write simply because they want to inform the world of something which they have seen, that is also part of their identity curation effort, which feeds into their sense of how the world works and how they work in that world. When we take that into the broader context now, so many different content writers, and the title of content writer has a commercial connotation. Then again, there's an intention behind that. And the intention is to make something obvious enough for communication to happen, for a relationship to be established, and for some kind of relational exchange to take place. So a content writer's role, really, in any kind of context, is to be as good a communicator as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a good communicator. Okay, we know good practices for communicating within different contexts. However, if we don't try to extrapolate these practices onto the web, but rather use emerging practices, which are web native, what would these be?
Okay, that's an excellent question, because it talks about the evolution of communication in an ever-evolving space that has no fixed boundaries. We know that good communication requires boundaries because they help create some kind of common background, which then helps us understand the message that is being actually transmitted. So if, for instance, I said to you, my brother is a seal, well, if you didn't know that, if you thought that I had no brother, you think, okay, maybe what he's telling me is not truth. So immediately you devalue that. Or you might think, okay, maybe his parents were into some kind of animal-human experimentation, and he's got a half-seal brother. But within a more sort of limited and bounded context, you think, okay, his brother perhaps is a soldier with a Navy SEAL, and it makes more sense, right? And we understand that. So this disambiguation in communication requires a kind of boundary setting. Now, in the web, we don't have that, and we tend not to extrapolate from the real life settings where we live in to the digital ones. And if anything, a lot of the times we seem to leap into the digital realm to get away from the real life settings and limitations we experience. So we go into the digital realm with a half-baked idea that almost anything goes. And here's how we can help guide ourselves in a place that seemingly has no guidelines. We need to look at the connections around us and how those connections make sense with each other and take a guidelines from there, which is pretty much what we do, for instance, if we join a group of people in a party whom we have never met before and they're talking to each other and we join the conversation. Well, nobody spends time telling us who they are, what they do, how old they are, and what their boundaries are, because conversation doesn't go that way. But what we do is listen carefully, see which jokes are okay, see which kind of information is acceptable, see what level of personal detail is acceptable, and we go from there. So if we take that guideline, we place it on the web, and the web can actually see this kind of interaction, then we're in a good position to have an ever-evolving communication strategy for an ever-evolving medium.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And looking at this, I'm thinking about the organizations and the enterprises that are not quite ready to adopt an ever-evolving strategy or worldview or whatever. They need boundaries, as you said. So how do you, if you write for the web, you know that you need an ever-evolving strategy. But as a business, you need to set some limits. How do you, where is the intersection between these two?
Okay, that's a little bit tricky, but not impossible to solve. And really comes down to the relationship between, let's say, a content creator and the business they work with.
Mm-hmm.
They both should be sharing the same kind of value system at the very least, the same kind of goals. And what a business that uses a good content creator should be doing is actually having a very able helper in a very difficult medium, helping them achieve what they want and communicating to them what they should be doing and how, and then also understanding what they want to achieve and helping them do it. And it's this kind of symbiotic relationship that allows us to understand how to best communicate and evolve in a digital domain. And that helps both those with a creative flair and who create original content, and it helps businesses which need original content all the time.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about the connections and the party we're at, and we're listening to the jokes and stuff, the thing is, or at least for me, what I'm experiencing with the death of Google Plus, I cannot help but mention this. I'm experiencing this fragmentation. I like to be fragmented. That helps a lot with different ideas. But at the same time, it keeps the narrative broken. There's something wrong with this scattered content all over the web within different silos. What's the best way or the working way to go over this?
Well, I think your question, which is a very valid one, is at which point do our efforts for identity curation begin to become either too expansive or need to be curtailed a little bit back.
Mm-hmm.
There is no one rule fits all here. Some people are very comfortable being all over the place, and some people sort of like to do one or two or three things, and they just like to maintain their relationships and their contact and so on through mostly those things. It really comes down to what you're comfortable with as an individual and a business, and ultimately a brand, I suppose, because we're all becoming brands to some extent. We're learning to project specific brand values, stand for very specific brand promises, and have very specific brand behavior. So really, you need an individual needs to decide, or a content creator needs to decide, what is it I'm actually comfortable with, and what actually informs my own behavior. You need to understand your own mind, and if you can do that, then you stay true to yourself, even though you may feel you're all over the place, because the things which actually allow you to be all over the place have an overlap in terms of interests, and that becomes part of your identity.
What do you mean by an overlap?
Well, suppose, for instance, that you are if we go through post sharing on social platforms, because that's the easiest behavior to analyze, and suppose that you're sharing rescue pets in one post and explaining how bad it is that nobody cares, and how they're perhaps societies which do a lot of charity work in that direction and they should be supported. And then you're sharing something else which might be focused on the inequality in resources across the planet, and then something else which has to do with particular work methods and so on. And those three things, which may be entirely separate in terms of domain and subject matter, can actually be informed by the same drive to create a certain kind of world where resources and inequality are more evenly distributed. So rather, inequality is less and equality is more evenly distributed. And that's really a value-driven approach to content sharing in this particular case, which becomes part of the identity curation of the individual, even though they're doing different things in different platforms.
So what made really great sense was the idea of curating and taking care of your own mind. Yes. And your intent. And that's a soul search work.
Yes,
isn't it?
It is. It is energy intensive. Absolutely. But I think it is so easy these days to actually share something, whether it's a tweet or a post or say something, that unless we actually know ourselves what it is that makes us do it, it becomes very easy for us to be overdrawn, make mistakes, overshare, say the wrong things, forget to be empathic in terms of different cultures and different approaches. And that creates an entirely new set of problems. And Yeah, this is part of the digital reality of the 21st century, and I think we just need to address it.
Mm-hmm. So just intuition won't help.
No, I think by the time intuition kicks in, we sort of intuitively feel that we may have put our foot in it. So I think we need to be very specific in our actions, and we need to always consider before we do something what effect it'll have, not just for us, because obviously we do most things for us and it's easy for us to see a point of view, but also the impact it'll have on other people. And if we sort of learn to think like that, we begin to see a much bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. That's again going back to the way we conceive of the web.
Yes,
if we
absolutely.
know that we need to keep the ecosystem clean.
Yes, I think keeping the ecosystem clean is a lofty ideal, and it would be brilliant if we could all do that. But I think,
is it lofty? It's my ideal.
I think it's brilliant to have, absolutely. But I think it's more just trying to have clarity in our communication. And I think if we see it as a purely communicative medium, then learning to communicate with clarity is a digital skill set. And we should all become digital natives in this.
Yeah, it's a great epilogue, a digital skill set. Again, to get back to textuality and to the broader picture of writing text on the web. If we are to think about digital skill set for a web writer, what do we need apart from clarity in communication?
We need an awareness of intercultural impact, and we need an awareness of the evolving role of language, because language is evolving really quickly these days. And if we're not part of this very living evolution of it, then our own ability to communicate sort of begins to degrade.
By evolving language, do you also mean the machine languages that are helping us communicate?
Yeah, in many ways. I mean, obviously, and I mean, the easiest example, if we go back to Google Plus, for instance, and these days on Twitter, we see something which we like, and we see a thread, and we may not want to become part of it for many different reasons, but we click like, and we are aware that by clicking like, some of the people who follow us will see that, so they will become aware of that. And also we are aware that we're raising its status. So essentially we're interacting and engaging with it, even in a little passive way, and we're adding to the conversation around a particular subject. So that is part of our digital skill set. This is part of the intentionality of communication that we're developing.
The awareness that you are part of the graph.
Yes.
Of the living. What is this? Is it a corpus of texts? How do you see the web?
Well, I see it as a corpus of ever-evolving data nodes and edges. And it's a very dynamic, very living thing that constantly changes from one minute to the next. So everything is connected to everything else, but not all connections are equal, and not all relationships are equal. And everything depends on context and culture. So data is the underpinning of it, but then culture changes data, and context changes everything again.
Brilliant. And we need to switch codes, right?
Yes, I mean, we need to always be aware of context, for instance, and culture. Otherwise, we're just trying to speak data, but data on its own is not enough.
Okay, David, thanks so much for this talk. Do you do you need to share something more about the morphing identities?
I think the only thing I would say is that we are part of an evolving conversation. I mean, the book which you have written is a very good conversation starter in this regard, and opens many people's eyes. And we just need to keep this conversation going, because it is only the beginning. It's far from over. The effect of it hasn't begun to really make itself felt.
Amazing times. Reminds me of a meme that said that the Matrix was a documentary.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much one more time, Scott. Thank you very much for hosting this. I'm sorry again for the technical difficulties, and stay tuned for the next episode. I will be uploading a script of this conversation on my website, and you will be able to read it and comment so that the conversation keeps going. Thanks, everyone, and bye.
Take care.